Well, I'm very glad to be here at this Frieze lecture, and thank you all for coming out this beautiful fall afternoon. Illinois at its best, I like to think. I go back to Sweden soon, so I miss the winter. But the falls here, I think, are really nice. As you can see, I will be talking about a topic that I have called transatlantic dreaming, Sweden and the United States in the 20th century. Now, can you all hear me, first of all? It's working, okay. This topic comes out of an interest that I've had for quite some time, namely migration of individuals and of ideas between Sweden and the United States. I'm interested in the ways in which the images of different countries were constructed and used in their respective national and cultural contexts. I'm interested in what happens when persons, and in this case ideas, are taken outside of their cultural context and placed in another one. American influences in Sweden that we will be talking about are transformed when they come to Sweden and take root in their new cultural context. They are charged with a new meaning, and a specific Swedish version of American culture emerges. A version that has its roots in Sweden, but is clearly different. America with a Swedish accent, if you like. And the same can be said about the image of Sweden in the United States. We'll be talking about both these. This is, of course, an old topic among historians on both sides of the Atlantic, the image of America in Europe and the image of Europe in America. It has been discussed many times and has attracted attention of travelers, writers, and scholars ever since the two worlds, the old and new, became aware of each other, like two siblings began talking to and about each other, and sometimes quarreling with each other, as you perhaps know. But these are imaginary Americas and imaginary Swedens in some sense. They are people's opinions about the two countries. Thus my title, Transatlantic Dreaming. Maybe there is a nightmare every now and then, but we shall see. Let us begin with something. Let's begin with the Swedish dreams of America, the Swedish images of America, the Swedish views of America. What?
Oh, I did that.
Okay. The United States occupies a special place on the Swedish mental map. If you think of a mental map, think of a New Yorker cartoon, you know, a view that a New Yorker have of the United States, where Illinois is about this big. Chicago might be in there. That's a mental map. Think of the Swedish mental map of the world. And the US occupies a very special place in it. During a large part of the 20th century, the United States has been a significant point of reference for Sweden that has placed it far closer to the country than its geographic position would suggest. In the mid-1990s, for example, a group of political scientists tried to assess Sweden's relationship to the outside world. In one survey, they asked those Swedes who had said that they had considered moving abroad within the last 5 years about their preferences. Where would you move? How many are going to move? 25% had thought about moving abroad. Pretty large number. They didn't do it, but anyway. And then where would you go? And that's an indication of the mental map. And among these potential immigrants, the United States was the most popular destination, named by 20% of the respondents. Number 2 was Australia, 15%, whereas other Scandinavian or European countries were chosen by between 5 and 10% of the Swedes. So if they want to emigrate, they go to America, as always. The US was also a common answer when the question was posed where Swedes would move if political upheavals forced them to move, as refugees, for example. The first was voluntary migration, but involuntary. And then the most popular choice was, perhaps not surprisingly, Norway. You know, if we had to flee, we'll go to Norway. But the US was not far behind, with about 20% also of the respondents there. Well ahead of Denmark in 3rd place, and Australia and Great Britain. So, the US plays a significant role in the Swedish mental map, I think. And it's not surprising that a Swedish author Torkel Rasmussen once commented that Sweden's American orientation became especially noticeable after World War II when, quote, like a super tanker with a new destination on the radar, the entire country turned westwards. Now, what has this dream consisted of? I will be speaking of several elements. We can talk about a dream of emigration, a dream of modernity, and a dream of consumption. The first one, dream of emigration, is connected to the great mass migration of Swedes to the United States in the 19th and early 20th century, when over 1.3 million Swedes emigrated, meaning that around the turn of the century, 1900, we say that perhaps every fourth Swede in the world lived in America. There was an America fever, and you know, they all came to this part of the country, or many came to this part of the country. And this meant also that thousands upon thousands of networks were created between Sweden and the United States, tying these countries together and creating an awareness of America in Sweden on a kind of a mass level, not just among the elite, but since it was usually the poor people who emigrated. And this migration of people and these networks paved the way for later influences, and I think one can say created a special relationship between the two countries that has lasted up until the present time. In fact, even during the height of Swedish criticism of the United States, and there is such as the Iraq War of 2003, when Sweden was very critical of what the United States was doing, a leading Swedish left-leaning intellectual, Anders Enmark, said that even though he was very critical of the war, it was difficult to hate the United States. And why? It had to do with historical reasons, as the United States is, quote, still the country of emigration where Aunt Ottilia lives. So these personal ties lived on, and he could be critical of individual policies, but not of the country as such. The publication in the 1950s of 4 novels by the Swedish author Vilhelm Moberg about the emigration of Swedes to America, that I'm sure you're familiar with, further shows the significance of emigration on the Swedish mind. The 4 novels, as you may know, trace the lives of the farmer Karl Oskar and his wife Christina and a group of fellow migrants who leave their impoverished life in Småland in southern Sweden to strike out for a better life in rural Minnesota. We meet them in Småland and follow them across the Atlantic to Minnesota. Their subsequent lives in America, including the Minnesota frontier, the relationship with the Indians, the gold rush, and the Civil War, are described in some detail. The books became instant bestsellers and were quickly translated into English as the Emigrant series and are still in print. There is the American translation. There's the edition, one American edition. And they're still in print, actually. And in Sweden, at the turn of the century, in 1999, a literary magazine on Swedish TV, a literary program, asked its viewer to nominate the best Swedish novel of the 20th century, and The Emigrants won, suggesting an enduring popularity. It was 50 years after they were published, and they were still very popular. In the second volume, called Invandrarna in Swedish, or Unto a Good Land in English, Karl Oskar, the main protagonist and America dreamer, has finally arrived to his America in central Minnesota, to the land he's been dreaming of his entire life. Moberg writes, Karl Oskar felt, he's now standing by the lake he's found there out in Lake Kishisaga, and he's looking for the land. I mean, he's the farmer, land-hungry farmer. And he writes, Karl Oskar felt as though this soil had been lying here waiting just for him. It had been waiting for him while he, in another land, had broken stone and more stone and more stone. And all the while this earth had waited for him, while he had wasted his strength on roots and stones. And now he stood here in the open meadow, the grass reaching to his waist, covering the finest and most fertile topsoil. He stood there gazing at the fairest piece of land he had seen in all of North America. He had arrived. He was bound, destined to come to this place. It's already been calling to him from Sweden, come to central Minnesota. So Moberg, reflecting the cultural and scholarly paradigms in both Sweden and the United States of the 1950s when the book was written, Karl Oskar is already an American pioneer, back in Småland in Sweden, for whom America and its opportunities then have been waiting for him his whole life. By making the long journey across the Atlantic and settling in central Minnesota, his dream is fulfilled, and the American pioneer has come home. And you see what they look like on the cover of the American edition. This is the story of American pioneers. They can be Swedes or Germans or whatever. The ethnicity, and it's interesting to study the reception of them in the American. They're pioneers. They're not, if they're Swedes, not so important. And here's the film that was made in the 70s in Sweden, and you see that they look a little different, these Swedes. These are Swedish farmers, not American pioneers. And those are two interesting dimensions of this book, how they're seen on both sides. Niels Hasselmo, who was known in this community, came to Augustana as a student and taught Swedish there, and went on to other things as well. He grew up in Värmland, in western part of the country, from where many immigrants lived, and he reflected to his relationship to the United States a few years ago, and he remembers how the Moberg novel struck a real chord with Swedes. As the author, he says, recreated the central myth of Swedish immigrations by placing these characters in America. They were placed front and center in Sweden. And Hasselmo says, I grew up with this myth. When I years later ended up spending months in Chisago County, Minnesota, doing interviews for a book about the Swedish language in America, I heard stories that Moberg must have heard and used. So he was also kind of coming home to Minnesota. The films here were made in the 1970s, and 10 years ago, Björn Ulvaeus and Benny Andersson of ABBA fame made a musical called Christina from Duvemåla about the wife. Interestingly enough, she is the main character in the musical, not the guy. And it has toured Sweden and played in Sweden to great success, and there have been plans afoot for bringing it to Broadway even. An English language translation exists, and the phenomenal success of Mamma Mia, another ABBA gift to the world, and the perennial theme of American immigration might be tickets for its success. It hasn't yet premiered on Broadway. Christina and Carl Oskar go to Broadway. That would be something. But it suggests the popularity of this theme. That's the message I want to leave you with. I mean, the Swedes, they relate to this, and they all know these names. Carl Oskar and Christina, and America is very present. The immigration then created strong and enduring links between the two countries. It paved the way and helped facilitate the enormous influx of American ideas after World War II into Sweden. During the post-war years, the United States emerged as a political and cultural superpower, exercising a great deal of influence on the world and on Sweden. This cultural reorientation that I spoke about began. And you can see it in many areas of Swedish life. For example, when it comes to literature, film, movies, since 1934, the United States has been the dominating country of origin for film shown in Sweden since 1934. And close to half of all films shown in Sweden today are from the United States. And it's the same thing on television. We'll come back to that in a second. A great deal of admiration for American political and social ideas can also be found. In many ways, the war, World War II, could be seen as a European political and cultural bankruptcy, and the hopes of many Swedes were now pinned on the United States. As we shall see, some sense of modernity and orientation to the future that many Swedes saw in America also resonated well with developments in Sweden itself. One example of the Swedish positive attitude towards American ideals during the post-war era comes from a young man who spent the academic year 1947-48 at Kenyon College in Ohio on a scholarship, where he was happily studying economics and political science. His name was Olof Palme, and upon his return to Sweden had a stellar political career in his homeland, ending up as the country's social democratic prime minister several times from 1969 to his assassination in downtown Stockholm in 1986. Palme was one of the leading political voices on the European left, and also became a very outspoken critic of the United States during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. His criticism of the US was so strong that for 18 months in 1972-73, the United States almost broke off diplomatic relations with Sweden. Palme was, however, no anti-American, as he was accused of being. On the contrary, according to his biographer Henrik Berggren, in a recent very fine biography, the United States became, quote, a formative experience for the young Palme, which would shape him politically and as a statesman. He found a new and different way of viewing the world and his role in it, an American-style liberalism which would affect his basic outlook on life for the duration of his life. In 1949, he reviewed Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead for a major Swedish newspaper. In the conclusion, he reflected on his experience of American society, saying that it was the American war generation which for a long time now will, quote, influence and shape the traditional cultural elite in a disoriented Europe. This was a generation in which Palme placed great faith and optimism. Quote, it is a generation which is carried forth by an enormous optimism and appetite on life, a sort of productive idealism which rambles through life in an innocent, happy-go-lucky attitude, still absolutely convinced of its own abilities and to be able to solve problems. The Europeans have a tendency to resign or look for ideals that he is convinced he will never find. The American does not seek the ideals. He accepts them as something given, as a crucial part of the American way of life, which in its best interpretation is a form of practical Christianity, basic rules for human coexistence. That was Palme in America in 1947. And it can be argued that he never abandoned that position, and that's why he was so disappointed in the United States in the 1970s, and always embraced the United States. American patterns of consumption and American popular culture became important, as I said. From the very beginning, Swedish TV depended on foreign programs, and the United States' share has been considerable. American TV programs became very popular with Swedish viewers, and during the first decades of Swedish television in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the Swedes were introduced to a host of American comedy shows, westerns, and police shows. Both on TV and on the movie screen, the United States was the dominating source of origin, easily outnumbering all other countries, including Sweden itself. Not everybody was convinced of the suitability of American television for Swedish viewers. To some, the American dreams that quickly became good friends in the Swedish living rooms were bad dreams, perhaps even nightmares. For example, the Western became very, very common in Sweden during the 1960s, with Bonanza claiming a special place in the heart of the Swedish viewers. Now, for some, it raised concerns about the effects of dangerous American violence of Sweden. A survey on audience reactions to Westerns commissioned by the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation showed its great popularity among Swedish viewers, but also reveals that many parents were concerned about the effects of their children. The television company recognized these apprehensions, but publicly reassured the parents that each episode of Bonanza was carefully screened, so that, quote, certain forms of violence, pure stupidity, racial and religious persecution, and sex with a sensational purpose would not be present. I don't know if there was much sex with a sensational purpose in Bonanza, but they claim that we have monitored the Bonanza very carefully, so don't worry. These concerns were also visible in correspondence between the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation and various U.S. suppliers of programs, the producers in America. Quote, many of the American series are too tough for the Swedish mentality, and we have even been forced to exclude some episodes because we found them too hard-boiled here in Sweden, wrote the head of program acquisition in 1960 to an American producer. And they said, well, as long as you pay for all of them, you can show whatever you wish, but you have to pay for all of them, and they did. But of course, the critique was a minority opinion, and it's safe to say that the pleasant dreams outweighed any nightmares in the 50s and 60s. Products from America were also in great demand. Refrigerator and icebox symbolized the dream of a modern, efficient home, and the blue jeans became the symbol of American youth culture. They were first introduced in Sweden in 1947 and created quite a lot of attention. As far as I can tell, the first ad for jeans, with a phonetic assistance here, how to pronounce it, could be found in the Stockholm newspapers in July '47, when the leading department store NK in Stockholm launched its manifestation, Klart California, ready for California. And here it describes all the wonderful things from America, and the ad then talks about this unimitable American fit among these blue jeans. Denim jeans, nu på enkel. They were called jeans, but when they came to Denmark, they were called cowboybyxor, cowboy pants. And the Danes still say cowboy pants, cowboybyxor. It stuck with, but you see, it says, trust lita på cowboys. De använder denim jeans. Trust the cowboys. They use denim jeans. Nu på NK, finally, åtsynsförsenade har de nu äntligen kommit. Considerably delayed, they have now finally arrived. Dessa knämmiga långbyxor i blått. These very nice pants in blue denim jeans. And then it says, denim jeans, uttal jeans. That's this inimitable, perfect American fit. They're snug fitted, but still incredibly comfortable to wear. So that's the dream of consumption. Another special kind of Swedish dream of American was the dream of education. The United States played a significant role in the reforms of the Swedish school system that took place after the war. Alva Myrdal, the wife of Gunnar Myrdal, who they both traveled to the United States, to write An American Dilemma in the 1940s, the major study of American race relations. She to study education in particular. She became very interested in the educational philosophies of John Dewey. They both had a stellar career in Sweden. They each won the Nobel Prize, he in economics and she for peace, but were profoundly shaped by their encounters with American academic life. And Alva then introduced American education ideas in Sweden. She wrote in 1941 that as the Swedish school system was in serious need of reform, quote, it is a matter of life and death for our nation that we receive new and powerful stimulances from American education. And to her, the most important aspect was the American comprehensive or common school, open to all students regardless of social and economic background, which contrasted greatly with the Swedish system at the time, with its division of students into several tracks of study, resulting in a socially and culturally segmented and non-inclusive school system. She commented ironically on, quote, the passion which Swedes expend in protecting a selected part of the country's youth from sharing its destiny with others for more than 4 years, that simply cannot be understood in America. So it was a democratic school, essentially, that she was arguing for. And the school system in Sweden was reformed when I went to school. We had a common school, a comprehensive school, much, I think it can be argued, influenced by the United States. The educational dreams also focused on higher education. Olof Palme, you heard about, and Nils Hasselmo, both came to the United States to study at universities and colleges. Hasselmo stayed, but Palme returned. Both were profoundly shaped by their time in American higher education. And they were not alone. During the decades after the war, after World War II, the United States had also became an academic superpower, attracting students from all over the world. It's the most popular destination for any international student is to go to study in America. And it's a truly global dream, the American academic dream. And it's been the most popular destination for Swedish students and scholars during the post-war era. And the American Academy has in many, many ways shaped Swedish academic life. According to a Swedish historian, Svante Lindqvist, Swedish admiration for American higher education can also be seen in the construction of the so-called Wennergren Center in Stockholm in 1960. Following a donation of 5 million Swedish crowns by the industrialist and millionaire Axel Wennergren in 1955 for an international center in Stockholm for visiting international scholars and scientists. The highly positive attention that was given to this project became an illustration of the high esteem which Sweden attracted to the world of research. This skyscraper, which still stands in Stockholm, one of the first skyscrapers, became a link between Sweden and the international world of scholarship. And this international world of scholarship was clearly associated with the United States, as many of the visitors were Americans, and the center was discussed in reference to the United States. The Stockholm daily Svenska Dagbladet noted that a pleasant environment for geniuses and families of geniuses had been created here, and that in the living quarters, quote, everything was even more tip-top American than in the United States itself. The buildings were described as the first time that the Swedes had begun to fully build in the American fashion. And several newspapers wrote about what may have been the first celebration of Halloween in Sweden among the families of the American scholars. Spökfest i Forskarborgen, a ghost party in the researcher's house. According to Lindqvist, the reporting of about Wenner-Gren was characterized by a combination of an admiration of science, academic life, the United States, and modernity. And it's all meshes together. And as Sweden enters into a covenant with the future, he says, through this international American academic world. Okay, that was some Swedish dreams of America. Now we move on to American dreams of Sweden. Of course, if the United States has a major place in the Swedish mental map, the United States has a smaller place, Sweden has a smaller place on the American mental map. It can be said that prior to the 1930s, perhaps, the major factor influencing an American view of Sweden was immigration. And especially if you lived in areas where there were Swedish immigrants, in the Middle West, Upper Middle West, on the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, and some other areas. And we can perhaps speak of some regional American identities where Swedish and Scandinavian elements played an important role in shaping the sense of the area. Think about Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon in Minnesota, and you get a sense of some notion there that this is Sweden, this is Norway. It has to do with the immigration. Now, with the end of the immigration in the 1930s, patterns of contact shifted, and American dreams of Sweden shifted. And interestingly enough, from the 1930s, Sweden came to occupy a place in the American social mind, as the intellectual historian Merle Curdy described it in a book published by the Augustana Historical Society. Sweden became, in the 1930s, in the American mind, in some American minds at least, perceived as a country which was changing and undergoing a rapid modernization. This attracted an interest among American academics and among American among American politicians. And it was the publication of one book in particular, Sweden, the Middle Way, in 1936 by Marcus Childs, an American journalist, represented a breakthrough for the image of Sweden as a modern and changing country to the larger American public opinion. It was no longer a poor country from which so many people had to emigrate to come to America to make it. And instead, reforms had taken place in Sweden in the 1930s. And it played a very important role introducing this new view of Sweden, and it was reprinted in many editions. The first edition itself was reprinted several times in a total of 25,000 copies. And a second edition came out in '38 and a third edition in 1947. And it was, of course, then a consequence of what was going on in Sweden. In 1932, a new president was elected in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. And in 1932, a new prime minister was elected in Sweden, Per Albin Hansson. And as FDR set up his New Deal to fight the Depression and to transform American society, Per Albin Hansson set out to transform Sweden, to fight the Depression and transform Sweden, and lay the foundations for what we now think of modern Sweden, the welfare state, if you like. And that happens at the same time. And they were very interested in each other. What are you doing? How are you solving these problems? And this is what this book is about. The Middle Way presented to American audiences the attempts that have been made in Sweden to combat the effects of the Depression and to modernize Swedish society in general. Its central message was that the country had found a golden middle way between capitalism and communism, and that the state and the cooperatives have been assigned a significant role in tempering the excesses of the problems of modern private capitalism. It was received very well in the United States. The Boston Evening Transcript commented that while the U.S. wrangles over the Roosevelt program, Sweden demonstrates how capitalism can be made to work by a middle road to recovery. And the New York Times called it a tour through utopia. It was also obviously received well by the Roosevelt administration. At the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia in 1936, when Roosevelt was renominated for a second term, the president himself held a news conference with Sweden the middle way on a table in front of him. That's a signal. I'm still looking for a picture of that. I would be very interested in seeing that picture. This is just a reference. And he said, talked about an especially interesting situation in Sweden where, quote, a royal family, a socialist government, and a capitalist system are working together, carefully, side by side. And this then laid the foundation for a very positive image of Sweden here in the 40s and 50s, as you can see. Model for the world, Sweden the welfare state, and Sweden attracts a great deal of attention, especially among liberals in the United States, especially in the Democratic Party. However, Sweden was not only painted in bright colors, a more negative image also developed and associated with the cultural developments and changes in the 1950s, when the country also became associated with loose morals and sexuality in the United States. A large part of Swedish sin reached Americans via Swedish films, and a number of them became quite notorious in the 1950s and 60s, even subjected to censorship from various American authorities. In 1953, the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman, his film Sommaren med Monica, which literally means summer with Monica, about a young man and a woman spending time in the Stockholm archipelago, having a great time, swimming with not too many clothes on them, but very mild for today. It was called Summer with Monica. It was released in America as Monica, or the story of a bad girl. It created great controversy. I think I have. And there's Sweden in the way. There's the book. The story of a constructive compromise between socialism and see? And you can see here, these echoes of Sweden as a socialist country still can be heard in 2009 on Fox News during the debate about Obamacare. You know, do we really want to change Sweden into, change America into Sweden? The healthcare system. First Canada, we don't want a Canadian situation, and then we don't want to switch. So the idea still lingers. Here is Summer and Monica comes to the United States. Naughty and 19. The devil controls her by radar. Perhaps you want to make early arrangements now for a dependable babysitter. Monica, who is a very bad girl, yeah. That was Summer and Monica. It was seized in Los Angeles, and the judge declared dangerous to the public, appealing to potential sex murderers. Its controversial status and wild appeal is also captured by no one else than Woody Allen, who as a teenager in Brooklyn had heard, quote, that there was a Swedish film coming to our local foreign film house in which a young woman swam completely naked. Rarely, continues Allen, have I slept overnight on the curb to be the first in line for a movie, but when Summer with Monica, he calls it Summer with Monica, opened at the Jewel in Flatbush, a young boy with red hair and black rimmed glasses could be seen clubbing senior citizens to the floor in an effort to ensure the choicest unobstructed seat. There. As Bergman's career as a film director took off, his view of Swedish society also came to have a significant impact on American dreams of Sweden. His 1957 award-winning The Seventh Seal propelled him and some of its actors, notably Max von Sydow, into fame, and its reception was particularly strong in France and in the United States. And there he is on Time magazine. He's one of the few Swedes to make it on the cover of Time magazine. Others include Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General, twice. Ingrid Bergman, another movie person, twice. Björn Borg, the tennis star, and some Swedish royalty. Now, Bergman's films in the 1950s and 60s certainly reinforced the American view of Sweden and the Swedes as fixated on sex. As this American trailer, and now we're going to have an experiment here, as this American trailer for one of his films, namely The Silence, suggests.
The Silence. Ingmar Bergman, one of the world's most acclaimed directors of motion pictures, brings to audiences this his most stunning film, The Silence. This compelling drama is an intimate, fascinating look into a world where people seek to communicate, through the ruthless gratification of their sexual appetites. Starring in a brilliant portrayal of the delicate and complexing intimacies of lesbian love, Ingrid Tulin, and as her sister, a beautiful, arrogant creature of the flesh, living only for lust and licentious pleasure, Gunnel Lindblom. Two women traveling through a strange land, a strange existence, where they find loneliness and a desperate passion. Few films in the history of the cinema have created the stir and controversy this film has raised by giving a long, searing look into the mute hearts of those who indulge their carnal fancies. The silence.
Coming to a theater near you. So that's Bergman and what he did for Sweden. It is possible to argue that this more critical attitude towards Sweden that we see now, that Swedes are fixated on sex and loose morals, also can be seen as a reaction from conservative circles in America to the accolades given to the country so far from the 1930s. Attempts were made by Republicans to question the value in using Sweden as a model for America, and its dark sides were pointed out. The best known part of this reaction to Sweden was an outgoing President Dwight Eisenhower in an interview at the Republican convention in Chicago in August of 1960 talked about Sweden, where its socialist philosophy has, quote, resulted in a high rate of suicide and more than twice our rate of drunkenness. So the argument was that and especially this business of suicide, that Sweden had the highest rate of suicide in the world, stuck. Do I have it now? And you can see, for example, here's an episode from Frieze. If you watch Frieze. The father says, "We do that. I'm just trying to figure out this chair from Stockholm design or IKEA." The instruction booklet alone would account for the high Swedish suicide rate. And I can sympathize with that if you go to IKEA. That's in 2003. I mean, I don't know, I mean, it lingers. And Eisenhower himself came to Sweden after he left office in the early 60s and was, received as lots of people are in the war hero, But the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry, I was misinformed about the suicide statistics." Of course, he blamed an aide. And he said his aide had gotten the numbers from Reader's Digest. Not the best source of the world. But it didn't help, because it still stuck, this notion of suicide. So, on a more general level, he also warned about the strong role of the state in Swedish society. Now that it's the welfare state. It results in complacency and lack of initiative. And the president's statements became a part of an ongoing political debate where Sweden was held up as a warning of the negative consequences of the growing welfare state. And you saw the quote by Dag Blanck earlier it turned out, after all, that something was wrong in the Swedish paradise, where high rates of alcoholism and suicide prevailed, in spite of a very high standard of living and cradle-to-grave social programs. This darker attitude can also be found if you have happened to see a Swedish detective story in recent years. There's this side of Swedish noir, and some of them, if you think of what do you call it, Stig Larsson's about Lisbeth Salander and all, that's not a happy scene, not a happy picture of Sweden. That's a corruption and Sweden as a negative. So there's this critique that comes both from Sweden itself and that is picked up on here in the United States. So we have a happy view of Sweden and a negative view of Sweden, as we have a happy view of America and a negative view of America. To conclude, Sweden and the United States developed a particular relationship during the 20th century. It was based on both facts, but also on dreams, perhaps on misunderstandings. Imaginary Swedens and imaginary Americas were created and became important elements of how different countries saw themselves and each other. The great emigration of Swedes to the United States in the 19th century was one important such element. All migrations bring with them what could be called long-term cultural consequences, and they can clearly be observed in the case of Sweden and the United States. In some ways, the dreams that it created, the migration dreams that it created, are still with us. Again, think Harry Home Companion. Or travel around rural Sweden in the summer, where you can attend so-called homecoming days for Swedish-American homecoming days for immigrants when their descendants are supposed to come home. Think of a recent Swedish television program called Allt för Sverige, one of these elimination shows where a bunch of Swedish Americans are invited to come to Sweden. They've never been there before. And they compete, they go through these competitions, and one of them wins. And the grand prize is they get to meet their now living Swedish relatives. I mean, so this is still a part of it. The element of modernity is also prevalent in these dreams. The success story of the Swedish model had one curious aspect, that the extent to which Sweden entered into a sort of competition with the United States as a symbol of modernity. I mean, America is always the Europeans, the modernity. You go to America, I've been to America and I've seen the future, was often a comment. But modern Sweden came to play that role also to some degree. I once met an American architect who said, oh yes, Vällingby, one of the suburbs of Stockholm, one of the modernistics of Stockholm. We went to Vällingby, and it was, I've been to see Sweden and I've seen the future. I mean, this is the way society is going to develop. These dreamers, many were leading Swedish social democrats, such as the Myrdals and Olof Palme, and many liberal leading American politicians and academics. A sort of spiritual axis running from Washington to Stockholm was created. America was to be regenerated by an infusion of Swedish social wisdom, while Sweden was to be rejuvenated by American optimism, if you like, on this word there. As I say in the outset, I see these dreams as a part of a transformation process in which they are mediated and charged with new meanings in their new cultural context. Swedish scholar Orvar Löfgren has put it, if Sweden was Americanized during the post-war era, it happened in a very Swedish way. Thus, what is Swedish and what is American is in a state of flux in this transatlantic tension and exchange of persons and ideas. In a real way, then, this helps to undermine and challenge notions of what constitutes nations and national culture. Thank you for your attention. Sure, if you have time.
Questions?
Now, the famous Augustana historian Ulrich Gevander is credited with once having said that the Great Migration was sort of a mass hysteria. Can you comment on that?
I don't know if it was hysteria or not, but certainly it was it became very prevalent. It reached very far down into, I mean, there's a study of emigration agents. There were agents that you buy your ticket from. You get your ticket with a train ticket to Gothenburg and then across to England and to Liverpool and then across to New York and then a train ticket all the way to wherever you were going in the Middle West. And these agents played a very important role. And there was a historian who found their archives and went through and saw the correspondence, how many people had written to them, asking how much it would cost to go to America, to try to measure how this fever or hysteria. And she found that in certain areas of the country, more than half of the population had contacted these agents asking how much would it cost to go to America. Not all of them went, but it gives a suggestion of how strong it was. And once the immigration got started, it became a self-sustaining machine. And that's typical in all migration patterns. You see it in immigration to the United States today. There's kind of a stock effect that one person goes first, and then information flows back, and then more people come, and it's self-generation. So Yeah, I don't know if it was hysteria or not, but it was certainly a very, very extremely important part of Swedish life. And one should not forget that about 20% of the Swedes returned. It was rather low for other European groups, had much higher return rates. Italians, maybe half went back. And they would come back and it would be circular. You move several times. But the Italians, sometimes one can think of as a kind of a labor migration, transatlantic labor market. People moving back and forth very often. So the statistics are sometimes off. Same person has counted many times. But in the case of Sweden, all these people who came back brought back America in a tangible way. And they became an important part of the local community. There was always a Swedish American. Oh yeah, that's a Swedish American. He was an American. And so it was very, very familiar. Augustana for many years ran a summer school program in Sweden in which I had the pleasure to participate. And one time in Grävestad in Bohuslän, and this was in the mid-80s, one time I had a check coming from, a tax refund check from here that was forwarded to Grävestad. And I went into the bank and I said, ooh, here's an American check. Can you cash this? No other problems with that. And she looked at it and she said, oh, it's a pension check. No, it's not a pension check. It's a tax refund. Ah, yeah. Oh, I'll take it. Oh, well, wonderful. I said, excellent. I thought in Stockholm, and I said, now, may I ask you, why do you think it was? Oh, but you know, there are many people come in with their pension checks, with Social Security. There were still returnees living in the area collecting Social Security, so that the bank was familiar with this phenomenon. So that's an understudied. That's actually an understudied area. The significance of these returnees. There was a Swedish member of Parliament who wrote a book about this. He was way off in his Hans Lindahl, he was way off in his assessment of the significance of it. But it's an interesting factor, and it brings back the United States on a very local level. A good friend of mine, she grew up also in Bohuslän and Strömstad. Her great aunt and great uncle had been to America. They came back. They didn't have any children, so she was often there. And he had an American car. Brought back a car in the mid-50s. There weren't so many cars around in Sweden then. And he drove around and he went into the gas station and said in Swedish, "Fill her up." And they all knew who he was. Oh, that's svenska calling, no? And her aunt, she made fudge and, you know, turkey. So, yeah, it's a very interesting, you know, on a very direct level, a piece of America. There's a very study of Norway, of a community in southern Norway and its relationship to Brooklyn. With an enormous exchange of people. Brooklyn was a major Norwegian settlement. And there were buildings, I mean, you open on the outside it looks like a Norwegian house. You open the door and inside is completely American. Furniture, you know, it's a piece of, yeah. So yeah, I don't think it was hysteria, but it was very fever, American fever.